All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session of the AIP conference. My name is Oscar Courchaine, and I am a master's student in Canisius College's Anthrozoology program. Today, my talk will discuss predation in rewilding, focusing on the case at Oostvaardersplassen, or OVP, to center the discussion. First, a quick content warning. Some of the topics I discuss are violent in nature, but I won't be showing any graphic imagery or going into too much detail. So to start, what is rewilding? Rewilding is a form of conservation focused on restoring an area humans have altered to some natural and cultivated state. It emphasizes the removal of structures like dams or roads, connecting areas of wilderness, reintroducing keystone species, including apex carnivores, to areas they've historically inhabited. In some cases, the reintroduced species may have only gone extinct in an area in the past 200 years or so. A good example is the Yellowstone Wolf Project, which reintroduced wolves to the Yellowstone Park region in the US. In other instances, species analogous to now extinct species that lived in an area during early human history, around 10,000 years ago, are introduced to serve similar ecological functions that they performed in the past. Think of Pleistocene Park, Rewilding Europe, or OVP. So what is OVP? In 1968, the Netherlands reclaimed 22 square miles of sea to expose the land for industrial purposes. However, the land went unused and became populated by migrating birds that had previously disappeared from the region due to habitat loss. Frans Vera, a Dutch ecologist, successfully led a movement to protect the newly emerged ecosystem, leading to the creation of OVP in 1989. In the decade that followed, Vera introduced ungulates supposedly analogous to those endemic to the region around 10,000 years ago. Without large carnivores and due to geographic constraints, the ungulates introduced, which are hack cattle, conic horses, and red deer, multiplied, leading to a mass starvation event in the winter of 2005, during which citizens protested the treatment of the ungulates and engaged in efforts to provide them with supplemental food. Most negatively affected were the red deer, who not only comprise most of the total ungulate population in OVP, but in comparison to the other species, they store much less fat for the winter. Authorities responded after the mass starvation event by next year preemptively shooting red deer that seemed close to starvation, leading to further backlash, but some population stability, leading up to another mass starvation event in 2017. Currently, this culling of red deer and selling of their meat is ongoing, as is controversy on the role of these ungulates in OVP and how they should be managed, if at all. So I want to talk a bit about compassionate conservation. Compassion tells us to consider non-human animals' best interests when deciding on a conservation action. Adding to the 3 C's of conservation, cores, corridors, carnivores, compassionate conservation places focus on 2 principles: individuals matter and first do no harm. It emerged counter to traditional conservation practices, which prioritize functioning or idealized ecosystems over individuals' interests or preferences. I argue that even if the ungulates in OVP get to live wilder lives, introducing them to OVP was not compassionate due to the inflexibility of their environment. Lacking any corridors out, the small size of the park inhibits ungulates' natural migratory behavior. And that's, in this context, the fact that large carnivores weren't introduced in OVP may be for the best. Next, I want to talk about ecologies of fear. An ecology of fear refers to a pattern of behavior that emerges in response to a perceived threat. We have long known that preyed upon animals feel short-term stress when fleeing from predation, but this also appears to cause sustained psychological stress akin to PTSD. Populations with a higher risk of predation also forage for less food and produce fewer offspring, making them less likely to overconsume plants in a given area, which increases plant and animal biodiversity. This instrumental role of the ecology of fear is well utilized in conservation practice. The cost is increased stress and hunger for the species suffering from it. Ecologies of fear other than from predation exist as well. Parasites can create ecology of fear around how they're acquired, and humans create our own ecology of fear when we hunt different species. In OVP, the ungulate's inability to migrate under the threat of predation may not have led to the same outcomes the ecology of fear is supposed to produce. The inability to flee may have led to stress levels higher than those observed in the wild. And so in this context, I think it's better, maybe for the best, that no apex carnivores were introduced to OVP originally. These ecologies of fear describe how living beings are affected by predation and other perceivable causes of harm. But it's important to acknowledge the deaths as well. As the organization Animal Ethics puts it, animals in the wild can suffer very significantly and die prematurely due to different factors, including hostile weather conditions, natural disasters, diseases of many different kinds, parasitism, hunger, malnutrition and thirst, psychological stress, conflict between animals, and accidents that can cause them severe injuries. Currently, most individual animals that are born die prematurely in their first 2 weeks of life. This is because most individual animals are arch strategists, or a species that trend towards having many offspring due to the likelihood of them dying prematurely. At the high end of the scale are species like insects and fish, which lay hundreds or thousands of eggs at a time. More towards the center are species like cats, rabbits, and ungulates. Then on the other end are case strategists like elephants, whales, and to a slightly lesser degree, humans. So a common criticism of OVP is that while its intention was to create Pleistocene-like conditions by introducing large herbivores, it failed to introduce large carnivores alongside them. But just because there are no large carnivores does not mean no predation is occurring. To start, foxes were one of the species introduced alongside the ungulates in the 80s. And while foxes are not hunting adult ungulates, they will hunt fawns, especially when they have young of their own to feed. They also hunt birds and eat their eggs, so they could be harming the many wetland species that OVP was designed to protect. Next, ungulates of all kinds themselves need minerals for healthy growth. When these minerals are scarce in their environment, due to inavailability of salt licks and things like that, they will resort to chewing on the bones of deceased animals. They will also resort to eating baby birds or other small vertebrates to get their bones instead. In OVP, this latter case is more likely than the former due to humans removing the bodies of the ungulates they shoot, making their bones unavailable. Of course, without detailed monitoring of this area, we have no way of knowing how much of these forms of predation are occurring, if at all. Still, the possibility remains, especially in an enclosed environment with a set limit on resources. Regarding the practical mitigation of predation, there are two main ideas in the conversation. First is the deliberate extinction of all carnivores. The second is converting carnivores to herbivores through some process, likely a form of gene modification. The technology called gene drives spreads specific DNA changes through a population. Humans already have gene drive programs in places worldwide where wild populations threaten human interests. These programs work by breeding sterile versions of the animal in question, then releasing them into the wild to mate and reduce the size of the next wild generation. Some examples include screwworm flies in Panama, Mediterranean flies in much of the North America, and Australia has been looking into doing the same thing with mice. Gene drives could theoretically be used in many ways, including spreading sterilization, turning our strategists into case strategists, and if we ever figured out how, converting carnivores to herbivores. However, these would all have ecological effects that we cannot yet predict. Interventions like these are often justified by quantifying the amount of future suffering that would be reduced if such actions were taken. However, those proposing them admit that we are far from understanding enough about the mind and the environment to consider enacting them. And the idea of eliminating or transforming carnivores in some way concerns many. Compassion needs to be given to carnivores as well. Through no fault of their own, they have fallen into an ecological niche that is difficult to exit naturally. Were carnivores unthinking machines, eliminating them would only be a question of managing ecological effects. But they are not, nor do they knowingly create the ecology of fear suffered by their prey. Further, they suffer in their own unique ways. Hunting is dangerous partly because many preyed upon species have adapted to fight back against those that hunt them. Even a small injury can lead to death when you lack medicine. Compassionate conservation calls for the treatment of all sentient beings as persons, who should not be treated merely as means to other ends. Introducing carnivores to limit the growth and regulate the movement of ungulate populations at great personal risk could be considered placing them in an instrumental role rather than treating them as ends themselves. This is especially true when other options may be available. The precautionary principle needs to be at the forefront of any enacted solution, at least until such a time when we can be more confident in our understanding of the natural world. We do not know what the effects of carnivore extinction would ultimately be. We do not know if converting carnivores to herbivores would even be possible, or if it would cause some harm that we can't even conceive. We don't know if we humans are justified in deciding on a future for a species, even if that future seems vastly preferable from our perspective. But if we can create an indistinguishable experience for carnivores, they can express their natural capabilities without having to harm real animals. There are several ways to create the experience, each with different levels of technical complexity, but all need to allow carnivores to stalk, chase, hunt, and eat as they do presently. In the far, far future, soft robotics would allow for a truly indistinguishable hunting experience for carnivores. Bodies resembling animals can be assembled and encoded with a variety of instructions that make them behave just like their sentient counterparts. In the nearer future, with the promises of recent advances in lab-grown meat, we will be able to feed carnivores without needing to kill sentient beings. Meat grown in biovats under large areas of land can be affixed to robotic frames resembling different preyed upon species, which are then programmed to behave much like we would with soft robotics, to resemble their natural counterparts. While the lab meat industry is currently focused on muscle tissue, similar technology could grow organ meat, including skin. With good design, such a substitution could provide a nearly indistinguishable experience for the carnivore. At the very least, they could express all of their normal capabilities. But what about today? We probably have the capability to make a system for smaller omnivorous species that engage in occasional predation, say foxes. The system would forego the expensive and complex robotics in favor of a combination of tracks and burrows. Dummies shaped like rabbits would zip along the track, catching the eye of a hungry fox. If the fox follows successfully, it will find the burrow where the lab meat is actually distributed. Not only will the meat be pathogen and parasite free, it can be given to older or sickly foxes by placing it in a burrow and letting them find it by smell, similarly to how they find and consume carrion in the wild. So if the foxes are not hunting real rabbits, what would then stop the rabbits from stripping the area of biodiversity as they populate beyond capacity? This is the standard counterproductivity objection. To start, supplemental feeding could ensure that the rabbits get plenty of food without overgrazing, much like we would be doing with the foxes, truthfully. Of course, plentiful food leads to plentiful babies. So the rabbits would end up suffering like the ungulates are now. Unlike permanent gene modification, contraception is a temporary and reversible technology. Some kinds are unsafe for animals, like immunocontraceptives, but we're only just beginning to understand the wide variety of contraceptive compounds that plants produce, the extent of their use in the past, and how they can be used safely now. Adding appropriate amounts of contraceptive compounds to the food we're providing to the rabbits would be trivial. And the same is true for the foxes, who would also likely overpopulate OVP given enough time. Still, there are inherent ethical issues in one species, humans, deciding how much another can reproduce. If it is to be ethical at all, it needs to be tied proportionately to positive interventions in non-human animals' lives. For example, if we eliminate a disease that kills 5% of baby rabbits in OVP, a 5% reduction in their fertility could be permissible in order to compensate. Lastly, as I've heavily invoked Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to animal ethics, I need to talk about the capability for species to live amongst other species, which is not the best met in my model. If foxes can live alongside rabbits without needing to prey on them, that may be better in terms of fulfilling this capability. In the short term, the ecology of fear would persist, but in time, new kinds of relationships could be formed that we would deprive them of if we separate them. But is it just to enforce the ecology of fear on the rabbits living today and in the near future for this potential outcome? Perhaps the best option is to separate them in the short term, but leave open the possibility of taking down the fence one day. As for the ungulates, it seems unlikely they'll be able to fulfill their capabilities in OVP. While they may serve an instrumental role in preserving the wetlands, compassion tells us that they deserve better lives than we can give them there. So it is time for us to let them leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that intro. I would just invite you, because my presentation is in an arts-based sort of sound presentation. If you do have good headphones, that would be great for this, because the sound will be moving a little bit spatially. So I encourage you to put on headphones. Can everybody see the video?
Yes, there it goes.
Okay.
Lately, I've become preoccupied with choruses as a model for conceptualizing how voices sound out living networks. I'm interested in what the sonic renegotiation of bodily boundaries can tell us about voice as a kind of operation. Voicings can join, gesturing between rather than heralding individuals as sites of liberalist subjecthood. I'm especially curious how joined voices, or choruses, perform a kind of shared listening. It both mimics and enacts something as ecological as it is aesthetic. I use the word chorus and choir speculatively, additively. The word performs like the signified. It's my entry point into the murky multi-species media assemblage that is bioacoustics. This research focuses on locating multi-species voices as features of collectively making, or what Donna Haraway calls sympoetic systems. My obsession with phenomena of voicing pulls me towards some of the most threatened creatures on the planet, amphibians. I partnered with the Amphibian Natural History Lab at the University of Campinas in Brazil during their field season. I used a phenomenological, ethnographic, and arts-based approach to consider both the singing behaviors in frogs and the perceptual and affective experiences of biologists committed to their conservation. The subtractive empiricism of science necessarily renders inaudible the commingling of voices that emerge between the scientists and the frogs. What chorusing reverberations coalesce around the meeting places of human and frog listening and singing? An adjacent listening position is required if we want to hear those frequencies. Bioacoustics has enabled a tracing of frog song across swamps to be heard echoed back through Raven Pro software, then further modulated in the sung refrains that biologists swap with animals, hum to themselves, and lodge away as persistent earworms. It's a reverberant circuitry, amplifying, replaying, remixing, revisiting, sometimes even singing along.
Can you just talk to me a little bit about in the day-to-day life of your research generally, or specifically, like how does listening function for you?
Well, frogs, they communicate mostly by sound, and for our work is super important to hear them. It's the way we can find them, it's the way we can identify them. Each species has a particular calling, and they can be really territorialist, and also is the way they can reproduce. So for me, listening to them is kind of a totally different experience I had. It's the first time I have this in biology, you know, with the sound, the bioacoustics.
When you are in a swamp or in a place that have multiple individuals singing at the same time, usually one of the things that I feel is like the 3D notion of the sound.
I work with Adenomera marmorata. I study the calls that the male produce, the advertisement call. Adenomera is a cryptic species, like she looks like leaf where she lives. She lives in a leaf litter. So, like to find it, you have to listen. First we hear it, and then we just stay close to the sound and try to find where it's come from.
It's super deep. I can't even express the complexity of their communication. For me, when I am in the field, I try to listen all those layers of sound. I try to listen layers of sound.
I mean, the frogs could be to the left or to the right, but also on top of the trees. And that's very tricky if you don't turn your head.
Hide and seek in the middle of the forest.
The feeling when you listen for the first time, you can separate the other sounds, and you just take one of them. I think it's really, really beautiful, right? Because you start to know the animals and the nature with the other form.
There was an evolution of how we noted the sounds. The first way to have a description of the sound was by the how we hear the sounds. You would describe different than I would describe because we speak different languages. And the second attempt was using notes, music notes. And now we have very complex spectrograms, oscillograms, and usually use that to extract measurements. We have recordings that were made in the 50s. They used a total different kind of recorder than we use today. We have a whole evolution of recording equipment. Today, we mostly use manual recorders. With directional microphones and also some automated recorders. With the automated recorders, we can sample an area or different areas over years, even over decades if you want. It is not possible to listen to that. It is not possible. So, for example, we could listen to a portion of that and create deep learning algorithms to analyze, identify in a practical way.
Like every technology we create, I see that way. I can be wrong, but we try to imitate our senses. So, and in fact, our senses work together. And it's subjective for each person. I try to really combine my perspectives, you know, and my previous knowledge with technology.
all the time we imitate when we hear, and it stays in the mind.
Something like this.
I always try to sing along.
Some species, they are a lot more shy, and they can see you coming miles away. Can they hear you coming too? Yes.
How do they sense you're listening? What's that kind of relationship there?
The population, they seem to getting this feedback loop. So when one starts singing, the other one starts, and they push each other and go higher and higher. And the other way is true. So when you get there and one stops singing, the other one stops and the other one stops. Like this domino effect. By being there and perceiving this interaction, I understood much better how they perceive the world and how they respond to my presence there, and you start to get this feeling.
But some species are not shy at all. They just keep singing and can put a microphone here and they're not going to stop.
We want to study frogs, we have to think like frogs. If they like rain, you have to go out in the rain. If they like swamps at night, you have to go out in the swamps at night. And then after that, you have to understand their behavior, like their rhythm, like their strategies. For example, there is a very common frog, they sing in the floor, but when you get close, they stop singing. And then if you give up looking for these ones, you arrive first and move to a second one. The second one will stop calling and the first one will start in the moment you leave, and you'll never find them. So you have to be patient, you have to understand they will start calling back once they are used to your presence there. We have to use like dark clothes or invisible in the environment. We have to think what they are looking for and try to mimic that.
My job in the lab is more like listen to music, because sometimes I stay almost a whole day listen to sounds that I need to catalog or something like that.
Frogs start to sing and have a frequency. Other species stop to sing. And when they stop, other species start to sing like, okay, it's your turn. You can sing now, like a game. Everyone have the time for singing. Right?
There is organization. It's not chaotic. The sounds, the animals have their tempo, they have rhythm, they respect each other in the sense They try not to call when their neighbor is calling too. We can correlate what's happening in the field with what we call music. Silence, on purpose silence. We have various individuals doing something together with a common purpose.
It is not because they want to be together, to communicate together, but they are together in the same environment. It is, in my opinion, it is really like an orchestra or something like that.
I know that a complexity of relationship that I sing when other species is singing, because that way I have less chance to be predated, but also everything was materialized in a sound. So for me that was amazing. I could feel it and my body wanted to move, you know. Choir is plural. It's not just an individual singing. So the experience is totally different. You feel part of something bigger, and that way you are something different. You are bigger. Sometimes you can feel the extension of yourself, like you expand outside your body.
Frogs they are facing a massive extinction globally, and we are already suffering some consequences of that. But we even have sounds that we won't hear anymore, distinct species, but we have recorded. We were lucky enough to have people in the field in the past, so that's maybe something very special for people to listen to.
Using sound as a skill, in fact, now it just transcended that. It's not just a tool. It's not just a skill. Yeah, and it's me. It's me. You know, my sense of here. It's things get more real, more deep. You know, I'm in the field. It's not just words I'm writing on a paper. It's not just something I'm publishing. It's not just metrics and numbers. It's real. It's a whole dimension I can explore, you know. I don't think the problem is the voice of animals, but our capacity to hear them, to listen to them.
My name is Dominique Augustin. I'm interested in a holistic understanding of the context in zoos, and today we're looking at speciesism in the zoo. So first, what is speciesism? Since the introduction of the term in the 70s by Richard Ryder, many academics, ethicists, and philosophers have attempted to refine its definition. In this study, I used the definition accepted by Caviola, Everett, and Faber. Speciesism is the assignment of different inherent moral status based solely on an individual's species membership. As a concept, speciesism explains how people behave. Why humans are almost always considered more valuable than non-human animals, and why animals with similar capacities are treated differently, eaten, pampered as pets, or perhaps kept at a zoo. While the concept of speciesism is most frequently discussed normatively, with philosophers and ethicists often arguing against being speciesist, in 2019, Caviola, Everett, and Faber sought to understand speciesism as a psychological construct. They created and validated the speciesism scale, 6 items, scored on a 7-point Likert scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Zoological institutions keep on display only non-human, non-domesticated animals, suggesting speciesism is inherent in zoos. Yet modern zoos tout missions of species conservation and high animal welfare, suggesting the assignment of at least some moral worth to species in their care. To begin investigating the incidence of speciesism in the zoo, I surveyed 431 participants, including 267 zookeepers, via online questionnaire on their zoo affiliation, diet choices, and the speciesism scale questionnaire. I compared zookeepers with respondents who do not and have never worked at a zoo, whom I call laymen. I ran a Mann-Whitney U-test and found a significant difference in speciesism scale scores between zookeepers, who scored a median of 2.5, and non-employee laymen with their median of 2.2. I found plant-based respondents scored significantly lower on the scale than omnivorous respondents, and found no statistically significant relationship between keeper and layman grouping and plant-based diets. I also asked respondents if they were morally opposed to the existence of zoos, and found respondents who indicated they were morally opposed scored significantly lower than those who were not morally opposed. I compared female to male respondents, as there was insufficient data from other gendered respondents to include in statistical analysis, and found female respondents scored significantly lower on the speciesism scale than male respondents. There are a few interesting results to consider. While non-employee laymen scored lower than keepers and plant-based eaters scored lower than omnivores, there was not a relationship between diet choice and group membership. In this study, zookeepers were just as likely as laymen to choose plant-based diets. When creating the speciesism scale, Caviola, Everett, and Faber also found ethical vegetarianism and speciesism, despite being strongly correlated, to be distinct factors. This lends support to ideas surrounding the meat paradox, in which people may report anti-speciesist beliefs in the abstract, but employ specific beliefs around food. In the context of zoos, perhaps plant-based zookeepers hold anti-speciesist beliefs about food, but make allowances for zoos based on speciesism. The higher incidence of speciesist beliefs and attitudes in zookeepers than non-employee laymen makes some sense, as zookeepers' livelihood depends directly on the continued captivity of certain animals. But I posit the existence of speciesism in zoos is complex. The speciesism scale asks respondents if it's morally acceptable to keep animals in circuses for human entertainment, but there's some key differences between zoos and circuses, namely those conservation and welfare goals, which to some people makes a world of difference. Does speciesism in the zoo mean zoo-affiliated individuals view captive wildlife species as less worthy of freedom or more worthy of conservation efforts? Coinciding beliefs about the efficacy of zoo conservation and welfare goals, as well as varying ethical lenses, likely impact beliefs and actions in the zoo. Still, speciesism might explain the decision to keep megafauna in zoos, which are more difficult to care for, rather than more quickly vanishing amphibian species with easier care needs, perhaps showing a view of large animals as more worthy of moral consideration and therefore conservation efforts. Future research might consider how varying ethical lenses, such as utilitarianism or rights, relate to speciesism in zoos, or compare zookeepers to pet owners who both benefit from keeping certain species captive. This is the first study to apply the speciesism scale to the context of zoos and opens the door to questioning the role of speciesism in this unique space.
Hello there, my name is Alexander Rhodes, and I shall be presenting to you all the effects of tourism on coral reefs. So to start us off, I shall present some background information on coral reefs. Coral is a megafauna. They are neither a plant nor a rock. They are anthozoans, which is the largest class amongst the cnidarian phylum. They are related to both jellies and sea anemones, and coral is a rigid calcium carbonated skeleton formed by polyps, the true and actual species that make up the coral reefs. Polyps have a very simple body structure. They're consisting of only 3 tissue layers. And something to note about them is coral reefs is they are volatile to both humans and non-human species, such as coral reefs contain 25% of our ocean's biodiversity. They provide food, shelter, and protection, and act as breeding grounds for all marine life that call coral reefs home. Coral reefs are highly beneficial for humans because they act as barriers protecting our coastlines from erosion and storms. They are also sources of food and new medicine, which have helped fight back against bacteria that have become resistant to the medicines we have been using. Another way coral reefs are beneficial to humans is that they offer jobs to local communities, such as local businesses receive hundreds to millions of income due to recreational activities. The International Sustainability Unit has estimated the net worth of the world's coral reef is nearly tens of billions of US dollars per year. Now, throughout this presentation, I'll be discussing 4 primary issues, recreational activities that have been affecting the coral reefs, that being scuba diving, snorkeling, fishing, and boating. To start us off with scuba diving and snorkeling, scuba diving and snorkeling have grown to be one of the fastest growing recreational tourist activities globally for the past 2 decades. One of the key locations where these activities occur is around your coral reefs. These activities have caused many issues, that being physical injuries and sediment deposition. However, a new growth that correlated to tourist activities is the occurrence of disease outbreaks. These diseases are white syndrome, black band disease, growth anomalies, skeletal eroding band disease, and skeletal eroding band disease. And they are primarily caused by either touch and or breakage of coral reefs, causing high amounts of stress on the coral reef. Such as there was actually a study performed down around Koh Tao, an island in Thailand, where you see on this graph where you see where they went out to each location and put out a graph to be your high use sites and your low use sites. Your high use sites are the areas where a lot of scuba diving, a lot of tourist activity occur, and your low use sites is where very minimal diving and scuba diving occurrences have occurred. Such as the research groups examined 10,499 coral and found that the low use sites had about 79 prevalence of healthy coral compared to the high use sites, which had about 45% prevalence of healthy coral. These high use sites have 3-fold increase in coral disease occurrence, along with physical injuries and necrosis from sediment, along with sponge overgrowth and non-normal pigmented coral tissues. The next recreational activity is boating. The primary effect boating has on coral reefs is anchoring. Anchoring can cause severe damage to coral reefs, which includes breakage and fragmentation. The damage amount and severity depends on the anchor size and type, along with the length of the chain. For example, damage that is caused by the anchor of a commercial fishing ship, shipping, and or recreational vessel have the ability to where they can dislodge the coral entirely from the sea floor, creating long-term damage to the reef. There was a study that was performed in the Florida Keys by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, which noted that 57% of the shallow water corals reefs found in the Keys have suffered from anchor damage. Nevertheless, anchor damage is only one effect boating has on coral reefs. There's along with pollution, where individuals driving these boats will litter around the coral reefs alongside waste leakage of fuel coming from the boats, as well as the use of anti-fouling paint, which is used on the bottom of the boats to stop barnacles and weeds from attached to the bottom of the boat. It is a toxic and poisonous coral reef. It is toxic and poisonous to coral reefs due to its high levels of carbon and zinc. If boats are not adequately washed, they can spread invasive species between aquatic habitats. There's also the striking of aquatic species by boat, such as your sea turtle species, who are vital to the longevity and ensuring the health of coral reefs. The final recreational activity which has been affecting coral reefs is fishing. The Fish Reliance Network has noted that fishing has become one of the most prevalent threats to coral reefs. They have observed that various fishing methods threaten 55% of coral reefs globally. One of the most destructive is overfishing. Overfishing has caused a wide variety of reef fish species to be overexploited as a commodity for the aquarium and food trade. Bycatch is another factor, where species that were not the original target were caught and severely injured. A third factor is the use of gill nets, beach seines, and drag nets, which can destroy an entire coral reef system and are considered highly unsustainable. They have been known to kill juvenile fish species and further the occurrence of bycatch. Some of the most destructive fishing methods are blast/dynamite fishing and cyanide fishing. These methods are primarily practiced in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Blast/dynamite fishing is a practice that uses explosives to kill and or stun schools of fish. And this practice also destroys the surrounding coral colonies in the process. While cyanide fishing is where fishermen use toxic chemicals, such as sodium cyanide, to kill and or stun the hard-to-catch fish species for the aquarium and food fish trade. Cyanide is highly toxic to the surrounding environment, and researchers have noted that for every 100 fish collected using the cyanide fishing method, around 11 million heads of coral are also sprayed with cyanide, effectively poisoning and killing the coral. With conclusion, how someone can better some of these issues would be things like education, awareness, management practice, and policy and legislation, such as, in my opinion, I do not feel like these activities should stop, because like we mentioned, they have been funding many things, such as recreational activities. Many people also provide on them for their livelihood. This is businesses for many people. So for things like scuba diving and snorkeling, I feel like with those, you just better education and awareness, such as I am working to be a scuba diving instructor. And from my perspective, when I'm doing my classes, I make it a major point of myself to teach skill about coral, about the effects of coral, like how to better safely avoid harming coral, such as like just avoiding in general. You don't need to be climbing on top of coral to have a good experience. You can just stay to the side or maybe about 10 feet above. You don't need on top of it to see all this beauty. You can see everything you want to see just by being from a good, safe distance. And also keep practicing proper behaviors, such as like keeping all your gear attached to yourself and not letting it float all around. With management practices for things like your boating, to avoid issues like anchoring, there's the idea of morning boats, morning boats to put over the sides, like and make it illegal for boats to anchor on top of a reef. You can keep your boats to the side or in the sandy areas where there are mooring buoys there for you to set your boats on, instead of being on top of a reef, to reduce the anchor damage. And then you have your policies and legislations. This is going to be for your blast fishing, diamond fishing, overfishing, and cyanide fishing. These practices are illegal and should be stopped, but they still occur anyway. To be able to stop those, we of course be the press to influencing further police policies and legislations to try to stop these management practices from happening in the first place. That's my presentation.